My name is Rebecca Martinez. I'm 29 years old, and I'm standing in my childhood living room watching my sister Sophia pack wedding gifts while my parents casually announce they're giving her our $400,000 family home. 3 years of paying their mortgage, utilities, groceries, everything that kept this roof over their heads, and they act like my sacrifices never happened. You were just helping family, Mom says dismissively while Sophia smirks knowingly. That smirk told me everything I needed to know about how long this betrayal had been planned. Before we dive into this story of family betrayal and ultimate revenge, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. If you're ready to hear how I turned the tables on my manipulative family, hit that like button and subscribe for more shocking family drama stories. Trust me, you won't believe how this unfolds. Looking back, the signs were always there. But love makes you blind to the worst kind of manipulation. I should have seen this coming when I lost my full scholarship to State University because of a sudden family emergency that required me to contribute my college fund. Dad's construction business was failing. Mom's part-time retail job barely covered groceries, and somehow 18-year-old me became the family ATM without anyone asking if I had other plans for my future. I worked double shifts at Romano's restaurant while studying business at community college. My hands constantly smelling like grease and garlic. My textbooks propped against the coffee machine during breaks. Every tip went toward family expenses, while I watched my high school friends post pictures from university parties I'd never attend. The sacrifice felt noble then, like I was being the responsible daughter, the one who stepped up when things got tough. After graduation, I landed a decent position as a financial analyst at Morrison and Associates downtown. The salary wasn't spectacular, but it was steady, professional, everything I'd worked toward during those exhausting college years. I'd saved enough for a small apartment in the city, nothing fancy but mine, a place where I could finally build an independent life. That dream lasted exactly 3 weeks. Dad's construction company officially folded, leaving behind a mountain of debt and a mortgage they couldn't handle. Mom sat at our kitchen table with tears streaming down her face, surrounded by overdue notices and foreclosure warnings. We're going to lose the house, Rebecca. 30 years of memories, and we're going to lose everything. The guilt was immediate and overwhelming, crushing any thoughts of my own apartment, my own life, my own future. I moved back home and took over the household finances completely. The mortgage payment was $2,100 monthly. Utilities averaged $300. Groceries ran about $600 when I included household supplies and maintenance costs. Property taxes, car insurance, medical bills, every expense that kept my parents afloat became my responsibility. I told myself it was temporary, just until they got back on their feet, just until things stabilized. Meanwhile, Sophia was living her best life at Riverside College, an expensive private school where she studied art therapy and spent more on coffee than most people spend on groceries. Her trendy apartment near campus was paid for by our parents, somehow, though they claimed poverty whenever I brought up my own needs. She'd post Instagram photos of weekend trips to wine country, designer clothes, fancy dinners with friends, while I ate ramen noodles and generic cereal to stretch my budget. The preferential treatment wasn't new. Growing up, Sophia was the creative one, the sensitive artist who needed protection and encouragement. I was the responsible one, the problem solver who could handle whatever life threw at me. When Sophia got caught cheating on a test, our parents hired a tutor and blamed the teacher for not engaging her learning style. When I struggled with calculus, I was told to try harder and figure it out myself. When Sophia wrecked Dad's truck, they bought her a newer car and said accidents happen to everyone. When I scratched Mom's car backing out of the driveway, I paid for the repair myself. Now, in our 20s, that same pattern continued with devastating precision. Sophia's college tuition was an investment in her future, but my financial contributions were just family obligation. Her artistic pursuits were encouraged and funded, while my career advancement was expected to benefit everyone except me. She was building a life, while I was maintaining everyone else's. The worst part was how my parents began comparing us constantly. Sophia's doing so well in her program. We're so proud of her dedication to helping people through art. Sophia has such a bright future ahead of her. She's going to make a real difference in the world. Meanwhile, My successful completion of a major corporate acquisition or my promotion to senior analyst barely merited acknowledgement. "That's nice, honey," was about the extent of their enthusiasm for my achievements. Jake, my boyfriend of 2 years, watched this dynamic with increasing concern. "You know this isn't normal, right? You're basically funding your parents' lifestyle while your sister gets a free ride through college. When does it end, Rebecca?" I'd defend them automatically, explaining how family takes care of family, how temporary arrangements sometimes last longer than expected, how ungrateful it would be to abandon them after everything they'd done for me. But deep down, I was starting to question what exactly they had done for me. They'd provided a roof over my head and food on the table, the basic requirements of parenthood, while systematically conditioning me to believe that my purpose was to serve the family's needs rather than pursue my own dreams. Every sacrifice I made was normalized. Every contribution I provided was minimized. Every question I raised about the arrangement was met with guilt and manipulation. The breaking point should have come when I realized I'd been paying their bills for 3 full years without a single month off, without a thank you that wasn't immediately followed by another request, without any acknowledgement that I'd essentially given up my youth to subsidize their retirement and Sophia's extended adolescence. Instead, it took something much worse to open my eyes to the depth of their betrayal. The engagement announcement came during Sunday dinner, a family tradition I'd maintained despite working 60-hour weeks and commuting an hour each way to keep my job while living at home. Sophia practically bounced into the dining room, her left hand extended dramatically to show off a massive emerald-cut diamond that probably cost more than my annual salary. "David proposed?" she squealed, referring to David Sterling, the corporate lawyer she'd been dating for 8 months. Mom immediately burst into tears of joy. Dad stood up to shake David's hand with genuine pride, and I felt my stomach drop to somewhere around my ankles. Not because I wasn't happy for my sister, but because I recognized the look in my parents' eyes. It was the same look they'd had when Sophia announced her acceptance to Riverside College, the same look that always preceded expensive family decisions that somehow became my financial responsibility. "We need to start planning immediately," Mom declared, already pulling out her phone to research wedding venues. A spring wedding would be perfect, maybe April or May when the weather's nice but not too hot. David nodded enthusiastically, mentioning his family's connections to some of the most exclusive venues in the state. "Money's no object," he said confidently. "This is a once-in-a-lifetime event." What he didn't understand was that in our family, money was always an object, and that object was usually me. Dad cleared his throat and looked directly at me with that familiar expression that meant incoming guilt trip. "Rebecca, you know how much this means to the family. Sophia deserves a beautiful wedding, and we're counting on everyone to contribute what they can." The way he emphasized everyone while looking specifically at me made it clear that my contribution would be substantially larger than anyone else's. "Of course it'll help," I said automatically, because saying anything else would result in immediate accusations of selfishness and family disloyalty. "What kind of budget are we talking about?" The question was purely rhetorical. In my family, budgets were suggestions that applied to everyone except Sophia. "We were thinking around 50,000, Mom said casually, as if she was discussing the cost of groceries instead of more than my entire annual take-home pay. Nothing too extravagant, just something elegant and memorable. I nearly choked on my water. $50,000 for a single day, when I'd been stretching every dollar just to keep their household functioning. 50,000? I repeated weakly. That seems like a lot, especially considering. I gestured vaguely at the stack of bills on the kitchen counter, the ones I'd been organizing to pay later that evening. "Maybe we could look at something more modest?" The temperature in the room dropped about 20 degrees. Sophia's face crumpled into her practiced wounded expression, the one that had gotten her out of trouble since childhood. "You don't want me to have a nice wedding?" she asked in a voice that suggested I'd just kicked a puppy. "That's not what I said," I protested. But Dad was already shaking his head in disappointment. "Rebecca, I'm surprised at you. This is your sister's wedding, a once-in-a-lifetime celebration, and you're worried about money? Family is supposed to support each other." The irony was staggering. I'd been supporting the family financially for 3 years while Sophia contributed nothing, And now I was being lectured about family support because I questioned spending $50,000 we didn't have. Where exactly is this $50,000 coming from? I asked, though I already knew the answer, because unless things have changed dramatically, we're still living paycheck to paycheck around here. Mom and Dad exchanged a look, and suddenly the room felt like a courtroom where I was the defendant. Well, we were hoping you could cover about 15,000, Mom said carefully. You know, as your contribution to Sophia's happiness. $15,000. More than half my annual discretionary income. Money I'd been saving for a house down payment, for my own future, for some semblance of financial independence. $15,000? I repeated, hoping I'd misheard. It's not that much when you think about it, Sophia chimed in, her voice taking on that wheedling tone that had always preceded her getting exactly what she wanted. You make good money, and you don't have any real expenses since you live here. Besides, when I get married, you'll have one less person in the house to worry about. One less person in the house to worry about. As if Sophia had ever been a financial burden rather than a financial beneficiary. As if her moving out would somehow reduce the mortgage payment or utility bills or any of the other expenses it'd been covering. The gaslighting was so smooth and automatic that I almost believed it myself. I need to think about this, I said finally. Because saying no outright would result in a family intervention that could last hours. Think about what? Dad asked sharply. Your sister is getting married. This is a time for celebration, not negotiation. That's when David made his first major mistake. If money's really an issue, he said with the condescending tone that rich people use when they're pretending to be helpful, maybe we could look at some less expensive options. I mean, not everyone can afford a real wedding. The silence that followed was deafening. Less expensive options. Not everyone can afford a real wedding. This from the man who'd just proposed with a ring that cost more than most people's cars, talking to the woman who'd been funding his future in-laws' lifestyle for 3 years. You know what? I said, standing up from the table. I need some air. I walked outside and called Jake, my hands shaking with anger and frustration. They want $15,000, I told him without preamble. For Sophia's wedding, on top of everything else I'm already paying, they want $15,000. Please tell me you said no, Jake replied immediately. I said I'd think about it. Rebecca, you can't keep doing this. You're 29 years old, and you're living like you're financially responsible for 3 adults who are perfectly capable of taking care of themselves. When is enough going to be enough? I wanted to argue with him, to defend my family, to explain why this was different, but the words wouldn't come. Because deep down, I knew he was right. I'd been enabling this dynamic for so long that I'd forgotten what normal looked like. When I went back inside, the celebration was in full swing. Mom was already on the phone with someone about venue availability, Dad was researching photographers, and Sophia was showing David pictures of wedding dresses that probably cost more than my car. They'd moved forward without me, as if my concerns were irrelevant, as if my financial contribution was simply assumed regardless of my feelings about it. That night, lying in my childhood bedroom surrounded by participation trophies and outdated motivational posters, I realized that I wasn't a daughter in this family. I was a resource, a reliable source of income that required occasional management but no actual consideration. And if I didn't find a way to change that dynamic soon, I'd wake up at 40 still living in this house, still paying everyone else's bills, still being treated like my only value was my ability to write checks. The wedding planning began immediately, with all the efficiency of a military operation and all the financial oversight of a drunken lottery winner. Mom appointed herself as wedding coordinator, a role she embraced with the enthusiasm of someone spending other people's money. Within a week, Shed booked consultations at 3 of the most expensive venues in the county and hired a wedding planner whose hourly rate exceeded what most people made in a day. My role in this production was clearly defined from the beginning: chief financial contributor and maid of honor, whether I wanted either position or not. Of course, Rebecca will be your maid of honor, Mom announced to Sophia, as if my participation was a foregone conclusion rather than something that required my agreement. And she'll help coordinate everything since she's so good with organization and budgets. The maid of honor duties came with immediate financial obligations. The bridesmaid dresses, selected by Sophia from an exclusive bridal boutique, cost $800 each. $800 for a dress I'd wear once, in a color Sophia chose specifically because it looked stunning with her complexion and absolutely terrible with mine. The dress fitting required 3 separate appointments, each requiring time off from work that I couldn't afford to take. But the dress was just the beginning. As maid of honor, I was expected to host the bridal shower, pay for the bachelorette party, organize the rehearsal dinner, and contribute to various other pre-wedding events that Sophia deemed essential. The bridal shower alone was estimated to cost $3,000, assuming we invited just immediate family and close friends, which in Sophia's world meant approximately 60 people. "Can't we do something smaller?" I suggested during one of our planning meetings, watching Mom add another $100 item to the ever-growing expense list. "Maybe a nice dinner at a restaurant instead of a full catered event?" Sophia looked at me like I'd suggested holding the shower in a gas station bathroom. "This is my bridal shower, Rebecca, not a casual lunch. David's family is going to be there, and I want them to see that we know how to celebrate properly." David's family. That was becoming the justification for every expensive decision. David's family was accustomed to luxury. David's family expected certain standards. David's family would judge us if we didn't measure up to their expectations. The pressure to impress people who'd never shown any interest in impressing us was overwhelming everyone's common sense. The breaking point came when I discovered what my parents had done with my credit card information. It'd given them access to one of my cards years earlier for emergencies, back when I naively believed they'd use it responsibly and pay me back promptly. That card had been sitting in their safe ever since, occasionally used for genuine emergencies that were always repaid within a month or two. Apparently, Sophia's wedding qualified as an emergency of epic proportions. I discovered this when my credit card company called to verify some unusual charges. $5,000 to a florist, $3,000 to a photographer, $2,000 to a caterer, and several smaller charges to various wedding vendors. $25,000 in charges that I'd never authorized, for a wedding I was already being pressured to fund separately. "What the hell is this?" I demanded, storming into the living room where my parents were reviewing seating charts with Sophia and David. Mom looked up innocently. "What's what, honey?" $25,000 in charges on my credit card. $25,000 that I never authorized for wedding expenses, that I'm apparently also expected to pay for separately. Dad had the grace to look slightly ashamed, but his response was pure deflection. "We were going to talk to you about that. The vendors required deposits, and we didn't want to lose the bookings while we waited to discuss the budget. You used my credit card without permission to pay for wedding vendors, and you think the problem is that we haven't discussed the budget yet." My voice was rising, and I could see David looking uncomfortable, probably realizing for the first time that his future in-laws were financing their daughter's wedding through credit card fraud. "It's not fraud," Sophia said quickly. "They have permission to use that card. You gave it to them years ago." "I gave them permission for emergencies, not for wedding expenses that we've already established are beyond our means." "This is an emergency," Mom insisted. "If we don't pay these deposits, we'll lose the bookings, and Sophia will have to settle for second-rate vendors." "Or," I suggested, my patience finally reaching its limit, "Sophia could have a wedding that fits within a reasonable budget instead of expecting everyone else to go into debt for her fantasy day." The room went silent. David looked like he wanted to disappear into the couch cushions. Sophia's eyes filled with tears, and I braced myself for the emotional manipulation that I knew was coming. "I can't believe you're being so selfish about this," Sophia whispered, her voice trembling with practiced hurt. "This is the most important day of my life, and you're making it about money." "I'm making it about money because someone has to," I shot back. "Because, apparently, I'm the only person in this family who understands that we can't afford a $50,000 wedding, especially when we're using credit card fraud to pay for it." "It's not fraud," Dad snapped. "And lower your voice. We're trying to plan a celebration here, not listen to your financial lectures." That's when I realized that my workplace hadn't been safe from their manipulation either. The next morning, I arrived at Morrison & Associates to find my boss, Margaret Wilson, looking concerned and slightly confused. "Rebecca, I got a call from your sister yesterday. She said there was a death in the family, and you needed to leave immediately for funeral arrangements. But you were here all day, and you never mentioned anything about a family emergency." My blood ran cold. What exactly did she say? She said your grandfather had passed away suddenly, and you were too upset to call yourself, so she was handling the arrangements. She was quite convincing, actually. Very emotional about the whole thing. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. "Margaret, my grandfather died 6 years ago. My sister called to get me out of the office because she knew I had the Morrison Industries presentation yesterday, and she didn't want me to be unavailable for wedding planning." Margaret's expression shifted from concern to something much colder. "Are you telling me that your sister called this office and lied about a family death to manipulate your work schedule?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you." The conversation that followed was one of the most humiliating of my professional life. I had to explain to my boss that my family was manipulating my work schedule to ensure my availability for wedding planning, that they'd committed credit card fraud using my accounts, and that I was apparently too spineless to establish boundaries with people who saw my career as less important than their social events. "Rebecca," Margaret said carefully, "I need you to understand that this behavior reflects on your judgment and reliability. Our clients trust us to be professional and honest, and they need to know that their account manager isn't going to disappear because of manufactured family emergencies. If this happens again, we'll need to discuss whether this position is the right fit for you." I left that meeting knowing that my career, the one thing in my life that was supposed to be mine, was now also under threat because of my family's manipulative behavior. The promotion I'd been working toward for 2 years was probably off the table, and my reputation with the company's biggest client was damaged, all because Sophia needed my undivided attention for wedding planning. That evening, Jake came over and found me sitting on my bed, surrounded by credit card statements, bank records, and wedding planning documents. "This has to stop," he said without preamble. "Rebecca, this has to stop right now, before they destroy everything you've worked for." I looked at him. This man who'd been patient and supportive while watching my family systematically drain my resources and undermine my independence, and I finally understood what had been trying to tell me for months. My family wasn't going through a rough patch that required temporary assistance. They were parasites who'd found a reliable host, and they had no intention of ever becoming self-sufficient as long as I was willing to enable their lifestyle. But understanding the problem and knowing how to solve it were two very different things. Because despite everything they'd done, despite the manipulation and the fraud and the complete disregard for my well-being, they were still my family. And walking away from family, even toxic family, felt like a betrayal of everything I'd been taught about loyalty and love and obligation. What I didn't know yet was that my parents had one more devastating betrayal planned, something so shocking and cruel that it would finally give me the clarity I needed to fight back. The discovery happened by accident, which made it somehow worse than if I'd been actively investigating their behavior. I was organizing my parents' bills as I did every month, sorting through the various statements and overdue notices that seemed to multiply faster than rabbits, when I found a manila envelope tucked behind the electric bill. The envelope was sealed and marked important documents in Mom's careful handwriting. Under normal circumstances, I would have respected their privacy and left the envelope alone. But these weren't normal circumstances. After the credit card fraud and the workplace sabotage, I'd developed a healthy suspicion of my family's secretive behavior. Something about the way the envelope was hidden, deliberately placed where I wouldn't normally look, triggered every alarm bell in my head. Inside were legal documents from Harrison and Associates, the law firm that had handled my grandfather's estate years earlier. Property transfer paperwork, deed modification forms, and a letter from the attorney explaining the process of transferring residential property ownership as a gift to adult children. My hands started shaking as I read through the documents, understanding hitting me like a physical blow. My parents were transferring ownership of the house to Sophia as a wedding gift. The house that was worth approximately $400,000, according to the most recent property assessment. The house that had been paying the mortgage on for 3 years, the house that represented every sacrifice I'd made, every dream I'd deferred, Every dollar I'd contributed to keep my family afloat. The legal documents were dated 2 weeks earlier, meaning this decision had been made and set in motion while I was being pressured to contribute $15,000 to the wedding budget. While I was being guilt-tripped about supporting family celebrations, my parents had secretly decided to give away the only asset that might have eventually compensated me for years of financial support. I sat in their kitchen, surrounded by bills that had been paying and legal documents that proved exactly how much my contributions meant to them, and felt something inside me break, not my heart, though that was certainly damaged. What broke was my willingness to continue being their victim. The confrontation happened that evening during dinner, a family tradition that suddenly felt like a mockery given what I'd discovered. Mom had made her famous lasagna. Dad was telling stories about his latest fishing trip, and Sophia was showing us pictures from her engagement photo shoot. It was a picture of domestic harmony that completely ignored the financial fraud and legal manipulation happening behind the scenes. "I found some interesting documents today," I said during a lull in the conversation, pulling the manila envelope from my purse and placing it on the table between the garlic bread and salad bowl. The change in atmosphere was immediate. Mom's fork stopped halfway to her mouth, Dad suddenly became very interested in his water glass, and Sophia's expression shifted to something between guilt and defiance. David, poor David, looked completely confused by the sudden tension. "What documents?" Mom asked carefully, though her tone suggested she knew exactly what I'd found. "Property transfer documents, deed modification forms, legal paperwork showing that you're giving Sophia the house as a wedding gift." I opened the envelope and spread the documents on the table like evidence in a court case. "Care to explain when you were planning to mention this?" Silence stretched across the table like a chasm. Finally, Dad cleared his throat and attempted his familiar blend of defensiveness and justification. "We were going to discuss it with you, Rebecca. We just wanted to have all the details worked out first." "Discuss it with me?" I repeated, my voice eerily calm. "Or inform me after the fact, like you did with the credit card charges?" "It's not what you think," Sophia said quickly, her voice taking on that pleading tone that had gotten her out of trouble countless times before. "The house was always going to stay in the family." "Stay in the family," I echoed. Interesting way to put it, considering I'm the family member who's been paying to keep it. David finally spoke up, his confusion evident. "Wait. I'm sorry, but I think I'm missing something here. Rebecca's been paying for the house?" The look that passed between my parents and Sophia was pure panic. They'd clearly never intended for David to understand the true financial dynamics of our family, probably because it would reflect poorly on Sophia's character and their own integrity. "Rebecca helps out with expenses," Dad said carefully, clearly trying to minimize the extent of my contributions. "Helps out with expenses?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I've been paying the entire mortgage for 3 years. $2,100 every month, plus utilities, groceries, property taxes, and maintenance costs. I've contributed over $90,000 to keeping this house, and now you're giving it to Sophia as a wedding present?" David's expression shifted from confusion to something approaching horror. $90,000? You've paid $90,000 toward this house? "At least that much," I confirmed, pulling out my phone to access my banking app. "Would you like to see the transaction history? Because I can show you every mortgage payment, every utility bill, every property tax installment that I've covered while Sophia was living her best life at college." "Rebecca, please don't make this about money," Mom pleaded, tears starting to form in her eyes. "Family isn't about keeping score of who pays what." "You're absolutely right," I agreed. "Family isn't about keeping score. Family is about mutual respect and consideration and honesty. Family is about not committing fraud with each other's credit cards and not lying to each other's employers and not secretly transferring property ownership while manipulating the person who's been funding that property for years." "We weren't manipulating anyone," Dad protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Really? So when exactly were you planning to tell me that the house I've been paying for was being given to Sophia? Before the wedding? After the wedding? When I'm 60 and still living in my childhood bedroom, wondering why I never got compensated for essentially buying my parents a house?" Sophia finally found her voice, and predictably, she played the victim card. "I didn't know you felt entitled to the house," she said, her voice small and hurt. "I thought you were helping because you loved us, not because you expected to own something." "Entitled?" I repeated, the word hitting me like a slap. "I feel entitled to honesty. I feel entitled to not having my financial contributions dismissed as helping out when they represent the majority of my income for 3 years. I feel entitled to not being defrauded by my own family while being lectured about family loyalty." "No one defrauded you," Dad snapped, his patience finally reaching its limit. "You chose to help with household expenses. No one forced you to pay those bills." That's when I realized they truly didn't understand what they'd done wrong. In their minds, my contributions were voluntary gifts that created no obligation on their part. The house belonged to them legally, so they had every right to dispose of it however they wanted, regardless of who'd been funding it. My years of sacrifice were just familial kindness that I'd freely chosen to provide. "You're right," I said finally, standing up from the table. "I did choose to help. I chose to sacrifice my own financial future to keep this family afloat. I chose to move back home instead of pursuing my own life. I chose to enable all of you, instead of setting boundaries. But I'm done choosing that." "What does that mean?" Mom asked nervously. "It means I'm consulting with a lawyer to understand my legal options regarding the money I've contributed to this property. It means I'm changing my credit card passwords tonight and reporting the unauthorized charges as fraud. It means I'm no longer funding this household or this wedding or any other family celebration that treats my contributions as disposable." I walked toward the stairs, then turned back to face them one more time. "Oh, and Sophia? You might want to start looking for a new maid of honor. I'm no longer available to fund and organize celebrations for people who think stealing from me is an appropriate way to show family love." David's voice followed me up the stairs. "Wait. Can someone please explain to me what's actually happening here? Because it sounds like Rebecca's been financially supporting this entire family, and you're all acting like she's being unreasonable for being upset about it." I didn't wait to hear their response. I had calls to make, lawyers to consult, and boundaries to establish. For the first time in 3 years, I was going to prioritize my own interests over my family's expectations. And if that made me selfish in their eyes, then selfish was exactly what I planned to be. The weeks leading up to the wedding were a masterclass in passive-aggressive warfare. My parents continued planning the event as if nothing had changed, while simultaneously treating me like I was the family pariah for daring to question their decision-making. Sophia alternated between tearful guilt trips about how I was ruining her special day and cold silence that suggested I'd committed some unforgivable sin by expecting honesty from my own family. Despite my declaration about stepping down as maid of honor, Mom continued planning around my participation. The bridesmaid dress alterations were scheduled, my name remained on the wedding program as maid of honor and beloved sister, and I was still expected to give a speech celebrating Sophia's happiness and our family's love. The assumption that I would ultimately cave to family pressure and resume my role as financial contributor and emotional supporter was both insulting and unfortunately accurate in its assessment of my past behavior. The final insult came with the seating arrangements for the reception. Instead of placing me at the family table with my parents and the wedding party, I was seated at table 12, between Sophia's college roommates, younger brother, and our elderly neighbor Mrs. Peterson, who was half deaf and insisted on discussing her late husband's prostate problems throughout dinner. The message was clear. If I wasn't going to contribute financially to the celebration, I wasn't going to be treated as family during the event. The wedding program, which I discovered while helping Mom stuff envelopes, contained the most elaborate fiction I'd ever seen printed on official stationery. According to the program, Mr. and Mrs. Martinez graciously host this celebration of love, generously opening their home and hearts to welcome David into our family. There was no mention of my financial contributions, no acknowledgement that the generous hosting was funded entirely by their eldest daughter, who'd sacrificed her own future to maintain their lifestyle. But the speech request was what finally pushed me past the point of polite compliance. 3 days before the wedding, Mom cornered me in the kitchen with a handwritten list of suggested talking points for my maid of honor speech. The list included gems like thanking our parents for their generosity in hosting such a beautiful celebration, expressing gratitude for Sophia's kindness and loving nature, and welcoming David to our close-knit and supportive family. "I'm not giving this speech," I told Mom, handing the list back to her. "Of course you are," she replied automatically. "You're the maid of honor." "I stepped down as maid of honor 3 weeks ago, remember? When I discovered you were stealing from me to fund this wedding?" "We weren't stealing," Mom protested weakly. "And you can't step down this close to the wedding? People will ask questions. People will ask questions." That phrase perfectly encapsulated my family's primary concern throughout this entire ordeal. Not whether their behavior was ethical or legal or kind, but whether other people would notice and judge them for it. The morning of the wedding, I woke up to find my credit card had been used again, another $8,000 in charges, this time for the honeymoon that Sophia and David were taking to Europe. $8,000 for first-class flights, luxury hotels, and romantic dinners that I was apparently funding against my will while being treated like an unwelcome guest at their wedding. I called the credit card company immediately and reported the charges as fraudulent, which triggered an automatic investigation and temporarily froze the account. Then I called Mom to inform her that her European honeymoon funding had just been cut off. "Rebecca, you can't do this today," she pleaded. "It's Sophia's wedding day. Can't you handle this next week?" "I could have handled it next week, if you'd handled it legally from the beginning," I replied. "But since you chose to commit credit card fraud on your daughter's wedding day, we're dealing with the consequences on your daughter's wedding day." The ceremony itself was beautiful. I'll give them that. Sophia looked stunning in her designer dress. The flowers were gorgeous, and the venue was everything she'd dreamed of. David's family attended in force, clearly impressed by the elegance and sophistication of the event. If you didn't know that the entire celebration was funded through financial manipulation and fraud, it was exactly the kind of wedding that people post on social media to make their friends jealous. I attended as a guest, wearing a simple black dress that I'd purchased specifically to avoid participating in the wedding party photography. I sat in my assigned seat at table 12, smiled politely when people asked why I wasn't in the wedding party, and watched my family perform the elaborate fiction of their generosity and love. Sophia's speech during the reception was a work of art in terms of selective memory and creative storytelling. She thanked our incredible parents for their boundless generosity and love, praised David's family for embracing her with such warmth and acceptance, and expressed gratitude to everyone who made this magical day possible. The only family member she didn't thank was the one who'd actually made the magical day financially possible. But the real masterpiece was my parents' speech. Dad stood up with tears in his eyes and talked about the privilege of raising two beautiful daughters and the joy of being able to provide Sophia with the wedding of her dreams. Mom added her own tribute to family love and sacrifice, and the importance of supporting each other through life's milestones. The irony was so thick I could have cut it with the sterling silver cake knife that I'd apparently purchased through my stolen credit card. Here were my parents, accepting praise and admiration for their generous hosting of an event that they couldn't afford, funded by money they'd stolen from the daughter they were actively excluding from the family narrative. That's when I realized I had a choice to make. I could continue sitting quietly at table 12, allowing my family to rewrite history and steal credit for my sacrifices, or I could reclaim my story and expose the truth behind their generous facade. I stood up during the parent speech, my movement catching the attention of several nearby tables. "Excuse me," I said loudly enough to be heard over the music and conversation. "I'd like to say a few words about family generosity." The room gradually quieted, with people turning to look at the unexpected speaker. My parents' faces went pale, Sophia looked like she wanted to disappear, and David's family seemed intrigued by this unscheduled addition to the evening's entertainment. "For 3 years," I began, my voice carrying clearly across the reception hall, "I've been paying the mortgage on my parents' house, $2,100 every month, plus utilities, groceries, and property taxes. I've contributed over $90,000 to keep that house, the same house that was given to Sophia as a wedding gift last week." The silence was absolute. You could have heard a champagne cork drop. I've also been funding this wedding through credit card charges that were made without my permission, including $8,000 for the honeymoon that was charged to my account this morning. I pulled out my phone and held up the banking app showing the unauthorized transactions. I'm sharing this not to ruin anyone's celebration, but because I believe in honesty, especially about family generosity. I looked directly at my parents, who were frozen at the head table like deer in headlights. True generosity involves giving your own resources, not stealing someone else's money and taking credit for the gift. I hope everyone enjoys the rest of the celebration that I've apparently been hosting without my knowledge. I walked out of the reception hall to a silence so complete that my footsteps echoed off the marble floors. Behind me, I could hear the gradual resumption of conversation, but it was different now, charged with confusion and uncomfortable questions that my family would have to answer. Jake was waiting for me in the parking lot, having left early to avoid witnessing what he knew would be a family disaster. "How do you feel?" he asked as I got into his car. "Terrified," I admitted, "but also free." For the first time in 3 years, I'd prioritized my own truth over my family's comfort. It felt like stepping off a cliff, not knowing whether I'd learned to fly or was about to crash into the rocks below. The aftermath of the wedding reception revelation was swift and brutal. By the time Jake and I arrived at his apartment, my phone was buzzing with angry calls and text messages from family members, wedding guests, and even some of David's relatives who wanted to understand what they'd just witnessed. I turned off my phone and spent the evening planning my next moves with the methodical precision of someone who'd finally decided to fight back. Monday morning, I was waiting outside Harrison and Associates when they opened for business. The same law firm that had handled the property transfer documents was about to help me understand exactly what legal options I had regarding 3 years of financial contributions to a property that had been given away without my property, knowledge or consent. Unfortunately, Attorney Harrison explained after reviewing my documentation, without written agreements specifying your financial contributions as loans or investments, your payments are legally considered gifts. The property belongs to your parents, and they have every right to dispose of it as they choose. The news was devastating but not entirely unexpected. However, he continued, the credit card charges are a different matter entirely. If you can prove that charges were made without your authorization, that constitutes credit card fraud, which is a criminal offense regardless of family relationships. I walked out of that office with a clear understanding of my legal position and a determination to pursue every available remedy. The property might be lost, but I wasn't going to allow my family to steal from me without consequences. My first stop was the bank, where I closed all accounts that had been shared with my parents and changed all passwords and security codes. The customer service representative looked concerned when I explained that I needed to protect my accounts from family members who'd been committing fraud, but she processed the changes efficiently and flagged my accounts for additional security monitoring. Next, I called my credit card companies and formally reported all unauthorized charges as fraudulent. This triggered automatic investigations and temporarily froze the disputed amounts while the companies investigated. Within hours, my parents' access to my financial accounts was completely severed, and they were facing formal fraud investigations from 3 different financial institutions. The immediate impact was more dramatic than I'd anticipated. Mom called me at work that afternoon, her voice shaking with panic. "Rebecca, the bank called and said our checking account is frozen. They're saying something about fraudulent charges and criminal investigations." "What did you do?" "I reported the unauthorized charges on my credit cards as fraud, which is what they are," I replied calmly. "The bank investigations are automatic when fraud is reported. I didn't do anything, except refuse to continue being victimized by my own family." "But we can't access our money," she protested. "How are we supposed to pay our bills?" The irony was staggering. For 3 years, I'd been paying their bills while they spent their money on luxuries and vacations. Now that their access to my money was cut off, they were suddenly concerned about financial responsibility. "I suggest you use the money you've been spending on Sophia's college tuition, wedding expenses, and personal luxuries," I said. "You know, the money you claimed you didn't have when I was covering your mortgage payments. That's different, and you know it." Sophia needed our support for school, and the wedding was a once-in-a-lifetime event. And what about my once-in-a-lifetime events? What about my education, my career development, my future plans? When exactly was I going to be the priority in this family? The call ended with Mom hanging up on me. But I felt lighter than I had in months. For the first time in years, I wasn't responsible for solving their financial problems or managing their poor decisions. Jake noticed the change immediately when he picked me up from work that evening. "You look different," he said, studying my face as we drove to dinner. "I feel different. I feel like myself again, instead of feeling like everyone else's ATM." That evening, we started planning our own future instead of constantly managing my family's crises. Jake had been wanting to propose for months, but had been waiting for me to establish some independence from my family's financial demands. Now, sitting in his apartment looking at engagement ring websites and discussing honeymoon destinations we could actually afford, I realized what had been missing during those years of family servitude. The legal consequences for my family began unfolding over the next week. The credit card company's fraud investigations resulted in formal charges being filed, since the unauthorized charges exceeded federal thresholds for felony credit card fraud. My parents received official notice that they were under investigation for financial crimes and would need to hire attorneys to represent them. Sophia's honeymoon was cut short when their hotel in Paris refused to accept their credit card, apparently because the bank had frozen their account pending the fraud investigation. David called me from the Charles de Gaulle airport, his voice strained with embarrassment and confusion. "Rebecca, I need to understand what's happening here. Sophia's saying there's been some kind of misunderstanding about credit cards, but the hotel is saying our payment method was flagged for fraud. Can you explain what's going on?" "What's going on is that your wife and her parents used my credit card to pay for your honeymoon without my permission, and I reported it as fraud because that's what it was." "Jesus Christ," he muttered. "Sophia told me her family was helping with wedding expenses, but she never mentioned that the money was coming from you without your consent. There are a lot of things about my family's financial situation that Sophia probably didn't mention." The silence stretched across the international phone connection. Finally, David spoke again. "I had no idea. If I'd known that the wedding was being funded through fraud, I would never have allowed it to happen." "I believe you," I said, "because I did." David might have been condescending about money, but he wasn't a criminal. "Unfortunately, you're married to someone who was perfectly comfortable with financial fraud as long as it benefited her." After that conversation, I realized that my actions were having consequences far beyond my immediate family. David's parents, prominent members of the legal community, were horrified to learn that their new daughter-in-law and her family were under investigation for credit card fraud. The social embarrassment was almost as devastating to my parents as the legal consequences. By the end of the week, my parents' attorney advised them that their best option was to negotiate a settlement rather than face criminal prosecution. They would need to repay all unauthorized charges, plus penalties and legal fees, and agree to have no further access to my financial accounts. The settlement negotiations revealed just how much money they'd stolen over the years. Beyond the obvious wedding and honeymoon expenses, there were hundreds of smaller unauthorized charges. Dinners, entertainment, clothing, even vacation expenses that they'd charged to my accounts while claiming they couldn't afford basic household expenses. The total amount was over $60,000, money that they clearly didn't have available for immediate repayment. Their attorney suggested that they might need to sell assets, possibly including the house, to satisfy the settlement demands. That's when I realized I had more power in this situation than I'd initially understood. My family had counted on my continued financial support and emotional manipulation to maintain their lifestyle. Without access to my money, and with legal pressure mounting, they were facing the real possibility of losing everything they'd taken for granted. For the first time in 3 years, I was in control of the situation instead of being controlled by it. And I intended to use that power to ensure that my family finally faced the consequences of their choices. The financial pressure on my family intensified rapidly once their access to my resources was completely cut off. Within 2 weeks of the wedding disaster, they were facing the reality of their actual financial situation, without my contributions to cushion the blow. The mortgage payment was due, utility bills were piling up, and they had no savings to cover their basic expenses because they'd been relying on my income to subsidize their lifestyle for 3 years. Dad swallowed his pride and called me at work, something he'd never done before. Rebecca, we need to talk about this situation. Maybe we can work out some kind of arrangement that benefits everyone. What kind of arrangement? I asked, though I already suspected what he was proposing. Well, if you could resume helping with the household expenses, just temporarily while we sort out this legal mess, we could discuss giving you some ownership stake in the house, maybe a partial deed transfer to recognize your contributions. The offer was insulting on multiple levels. After years of dismissing my contributions as family obligation, they were suddenly willing to acknowledge them now that they needed my money again. After secretly planning to give the entire house to Sophia, they were now offering me a partial stake as if they were being generous rather than desperate. Let me understand this correctly, I said slowly. You want me to resume paying your bills while you're under investigation for stealing my money, and in exchange, you'll give me partial ownership of a house that I've essentially been buying for 3 years? When you put it like that, it sounds bad, but we're family, Rebecca. We should be able to work through this together. You're absolutely right. We are family. Which is why it's so devastating that you chose to steal from me instead of having an honest conversation about your financial needs. The conversation ended with Dad hanging up on me, but I knew they'd be back. Their financial situation was deteriorating rapidly, and I was their only potential source of relief. Meanwhile, Sophia's marriage was crumbling under the pressure of the fraud scandal. David's parents had made it clear that they were appalled by their new daughter-in-law's behavior and questioned her character and integrity. David himself was struggling with the realization that he'd married into a family of financial fraudsters who'd manipulated him just as much as they'd manipulated me. I filed for annulment, he told me during a phone call 3 weeks after the wedding. My attorney says we have grounds based on fraud and misrepresentation. I never would have married Sophia if I'd known the truth about your family's financial situation. I'm sorry it came to this, I said, and I meant it. David might have been condescending, but he didn't deserve to be deceived and manipulated. Don't apologize. You tried to tell us the truth, and we chose not to listen. Sophia and her parents created this situation through their own choices. The annulment proceedings became public record, which meant that everyone in my parents' social circle learned about the fraud charges and the collapse of Sophia's marriage. Mom couldn't show her face at church without fielding uncomfortable questions about criminal investigations. Dad's fishing buddies stopped inviting him to their weekly outings. The social isolation was almost as painful for them as the financial pressure. The community response was swift and decisive. Mrs. Peterson, our elderly neighbor who'd been seated next to me at the wedding reception, had apparently been paying close attention during my revelation. She spread the story throughout the neighborhood with the efficiency of a professional gossip columnist. Within days, everyone in our subdivision knew that the Martinez family was under investigation for defrauding their own daughter. The neighborhood's reaction split along predictable lines. Older residents who'd known my family for years were shocked and disappointed by the revelations. Younger families with their own financial struggles were outraged that my parents had been living beyond their means while their daughter sacrificed her future to enable their lifestyle. But the most significant community response came from an unexpected source. Maria Santos, the financial advisor who'd helped me understand my legal options, had connections throughout the local business community. Word spread quickly among financial professionals that the Martinez family had committed credit card fraud against their own daughter to fund an extravagant wedding. This professional network effect had consequences that my family hadn't anticipated. Dad's attempts to find new clients for his struggling construction business were hampered by his reputation for financial dishonesty. Mom's part-time retail job became uncomfortable when customers recognized her from local news coverage of the fraud case. Even Sophia found that her job prospects were limited by association with a family that was notorious for financial manipulation. The legal pressure continued mounting as well. The federal investigation into credit card fraud had expanded to include mail fraud charges related to the false documentation they'd used to hide unauthorized charges. Their attorney, who was charging premium rates for criminal defense work, advised them that their best option was still a settlement that would require full restitution plus penalties. The settlement amount had grown to over $80,000, including unauthorized charges, penalty fees, interest, and legal costs. It was more money than they could possibly raise without selling major assets, which brought us back to the house that had started this entire conflict. "We might have to sell the house," Mom admitted during a phone call, her voice thick with tears. 30 years of memories, and we might lose everything because of this misunderstanding. "It wasn't a misunderstanding," I corrected her. "It was theft. You stole my money to fund a lifestyle you couldn't afford, and now you're facing the consequences of that choice." "We never thought of it as stealing. We thought of it as family helping family. Family helping family involves asking for help and being grateful when it's provided. It doesn't involve secretly taking money and then giving away the assets that the money supported." The conversation revealed something important about my parents' mindset. Even after months of legal consequences and social embarrassment, they still didn't fully understand that their behavior was wrong. They saw themselves as victims of an ungrateful daughter rather than perpetrators of financial abuse. But their self-perception didn't change the reality of their situation. Within 6 weeks of the wedding disaster, they were facing foreclosure proceedings, criminal charges, and complete social isolation. The life they'd built on my financial support was collapsing rapidly now that the support was gone. Jake proposed to me during this period, choosing a quiet moment when we were planning our own future rather than managing someone else's crisis. "I want to marry you because I love you, not because I need you to solve my problems," he said, presenting a modest but beautiful ring that we'd chosen together, based on our actual budget rather than stolen credit. The contrast between his proposal and Sophia's entire relationship was stark. Jake valued my independence and encouraged my career goals. He wanted to build a partnership based on mutual respect and shared responsibilities. He saw my family's treatment of me as unacceptable and supported my decision to establish boundaries, even when those boundaries were painful. Planning our wedding became an exercise in healthy decision-making. We discussed our budget honestly, made choices based on what we could afford, and included family members who supported our relationship, rather than exploiting it. The guest list didn't include my parents or Sophia, not because I wanted to hurt them, but because I couldn't trust them to participate in my celebration without trying to manipulate or sabotage it. As my parents' legal and financial situation continued deteriorating, I realized that I had achieved something I'd never expected: complete freedom from their manipulation. For the first time in my adult life, my decisions were based on my own needs and values, rather than their emotional and financial demands. The power dynamic had shifted completely. Instead of me needing their approval and acceptance, they needed my forgiveness and financial assistance. But forgiveness, I was learning, didn't require me to resume being their victim. And financial assistance was something I was no longer willing to provide to people who'd proven they would abuse it. The final settlement negotiations took place 6 months after the wedding disaster, in a conference room that smelled like stale coffee and broken dreams. My parents sat across from me with their attorney, looking older and more defeated than I'd ever seen them. The federal fraud charges had been resolved with a plea agreement, but the civil settlement still needed to be finalized. "My clients are prepared to offer full restitution for the unauthorized charges," their attorney announced, sliding a document across the polished conference table. "The total amount is $87,000, which includes all disputed charges, penalty fees, and interest calculations." $87,000. Almost exactly what I'd calculated as my total contributions to their household over 3 years, though the money they owed me now represented stolen funds rather than voluntary support. The symmetry was darkly ironic. "How do your clients propose to pay this amount?" my attorney asked. "Because we all knew they didn't have $87,000 sitting in a bank account somewhere. They're prepared to sell the family home," the attorney replied reluctantly. "The property has been appraised at $420,000. After paying off the existing mortgage and settlement costs, there should be sufficient proceeds to satisfy the restitution requirements. The same house that was supposed to be Sophia's wedding gift, the same house that I'd been paying to maintain for 3 years, was now being sold to compensate me for the money my family had stolen. It felt like cosmic justice, if cosmic justice came with a side order of family destruction. And what about the deed transfer to your daughter? My attorney pressed. The property was gifted to Sophia Martinez Sterling prior to these proceedings. That transfer has been voided, came the terse reply. The recipient's divorce proceedings complicated the ownership structure, and the property has reverted to my clients pending this settlement. Sophia's divorce from David had been finalized the previous month, just 5 months after their elaborate wedding. The annulment had been denied because too much time had passed and too many legal complications had arisen, but David had successfully argued for divorce based on fraud and misrepresentation. Sophia had received nothing from the divorce settlement, not even spousal support, because the court had determined that Shed entered the marriage under false pretenses. The aftermath of that legal decision had been devastating for Sophia personally. Shed moved back in with our parents, effectively homeless and unemployed, with a reputation for financial dishonesty that made finding new employment extremely difficult. Her college friends had distanced themselves after learning about the fraud charges, and David's social circle had completely ostracized her. "Where will your clients live after the house sale?" my attorney asked, a question that I'd been wondering about myself. "They've located a rental apartment in Meadowbrook," the attorney replied, naming a significantly less affluent neighborhood about 20 miles away from their current location. "It's a 2-bedroom unit that fits within their reduced budget." Reduced budget. That was a polite way of saying they'd been forced to live within their actual means for the first time in years. Without access to my income and with their credit destroyed by the fraud convictions, they were experiencing genuine financial hardship for the first time since I'd started supporting them. The settlement was finalized that afternoon, with a payment schedule that would transfer the money to my accounts within 60 days of the house sale. As we left the conference room, Mom tried one last appeal to my emotions. "Rebecca, I hope you know that we never intended for things to end up like this. We love you, and we're proud of you, and we're sorry that our mistakes hurt you so badly." I looked at this woman who'd raised me, who'd taught me about family loyalty and sacrifice, who'd systematically exploited those lessons to manipulate me into funding her lifestyle for years. "I believe that you love me," I said finally. "But I also know that your love comes with conditions that I'm no longer willing to meet." "What does that mean?" "It means I forgive you for what you did, but I won't forget it. And I won't put myself in a position to be victimized by this family again." That was the last time we spoke for over a year. Jake and I were married 4 months later in a small ceremony at a local vineyard. The guest list included close friends, supportive extended family members, and Jake's parents, who'd welcomed me into their family with genuine warmth and respect. The wedding cost $8,000, money we'd saved together and spent consciously, creating a celebration that reflected our values rather than anyone else's expectations. Maria Santos attended the wedding and told me during the reception that Shed started referring other clients who were dealing with family financial abuse. "Your case opened a lot of eyes in the professional community," she said. "Financial abuse by family members is more common than people realize, and victims often don't know they have legal options." The house sold 3 weeks after our wedding, and I received the settlement check just before Jake and I left for our honeymoon in Costa Rica. $87,000. Money that represented both restitution for theft and compensation for years of financial sacrifice. I deposited the check and used a portion of it as a down payment on our own home, a modest 3-bedroom house in a quiet neighborhood where nobody knew about my family's drama. But the money wasn't the real victory. The real victory was the freedom to build a life based on my own choices rather than my family's demands. Jake and I could plan for our future without worrying about sudden financial emergencies from my parents. We could make decisions about careers and children and investments based on our own priorities rather than external manipulation. The local newspaper ran a small story about the fraud case, focusing on the broader issue of financial abuse within families. My name wasn't mentioned, but the details were recognizable to anyone who knew our family. The article included statistics about elder abuse and financial exploitation, ironically positioning my parents as potential victims rather than perpetrators. 6 months after the settlement, I received a letter from Sophia. She was living with a roommate in a small apartment, working as a waitress while trying to rebuild her life after the divorce and fraud scandal. The letter was an apology, of sorts, though it focused more on how the situation had hurt her than on acknowledging the harm she'd caused me. "I know you probably hate me," she wrote, "but I hope someday we can be sisters again. I never understood how much you were sacrificing for the family until I had to live without that support. I'm learning to take care of myself for the first time, and it's harder than I ever imagined." I didn't respond to the letter immediately. The wounds were still too fresh, and I wasn't ready to risk being manipulated again by someone who'd participated in defrauding me for years. But I didn't throw the letter away either. I kept it in my desk drawer, a reminder that forgiveness might be possible someday, even if reconciliation wasn't. The final piece of justice came from an unexpected source. David's parents, still embarrassed by their son's brief marriage to someone from a family of fraudsters, had quietly spread word throughout their professional network about my family's behavior. When Dad tried to restart his construction business under a new company name, potential clients kept discovering his history of financial dishonesty through these professional connections. The reputation damage was so severe that Dad eventually gave up on self-employment and took a job as a maintenance supervisor at a local school district. It was honest work with steady pay, but it represented a significant step down from his previous ambitions of running a successful construction company. Mom found work as a bookkeeper for a small medical practice, a job that required bonding and background checks that nearly disqualified her due to the fraud convictions. She was hired only because the practice owner was a family friend who believed in second chances, though her salary was significantly lower than what someone with her experience would normally command. They were learning to live within their means, perhaps for the first time in their adult lives. The apartment in Meadowbrook was clean but modest, furnished with pieces from their old house that hadn't been sold to pay legal fees. They drove used cars, bought generic groceries, and spent their evenings watching television rather than going out to restaurants they couldn't afford. It was the life they should have been living all along, if they hadn't been using their daughter's income to maintain a facade of prosperity they'd never actually earned. The healing process took longer than Id anticipated and followed a path Id never expected. For months after the settlement, I felt a strange combination of vindication and grief that was difficult to process. Id won the legal battle and recovered my stolen money, but Id also lost the family relationships that had defined my identity for 29 years. Jake suggested therapy, not because he thought I was damaged, but because he recognized that I was processing a complex trauma that wouldn't resolve itself through willpower alone. "You've been conditioned to put everyone else's needs before your own since childhood," he said gently. "Learning to prioritize yourself is going to take practice." Dr. Elizabeth Chen specialized in family trauma and financial abuse, two areas that overlapped more frequently than Id realized. During our first session, she explained that financial abuse was often a component of broader narcissistic family systems, where one family member was designated as the caretaker and resource provider, while others were protected from consequences and accountability. Families with these dynamics often have one child who's trained from an early age to be responsible for everyone else's emotional and financial well-being, she explained. That child grows up believing that love is conditional on their ability to solve problems and provide resources, which creates a cycle of exploitation that can continue for decades. The description fit my family perfectly. I'd been the designated problem solver since childhood, the one who was expected to sacrifice for the greater good, while Sophia was protected and pampered. My parents' love had always felt conditional on my ability to meet their needs, which explained why I'd been so devastated by their betrayal. Through therapy, I learned to recognize the manipulation techniques that had been used against me for years: guilt trips about family loyalty, emotional blackmail disguised as expressions of love, gaslighting that made me question my own perceptions of unfair treatment. I began to understand that my family's behavior wasn't simply misguided or selfish. It was a systematic pattern of emotional and financial abuse. The hardest part was accepting that this pattern wasn't my fault and wasn't something I could have prevented through better communication or clearer boundaries. My family had chosen to exploit my love and loyalty rather than respecting it, and that choice said nothing about my worth as a person and everything about their character. As my understanding of the situation deepened, I felt increasingly grateful for the events that had forced me to break free from their manipulation. The wedding disaster had been painful and humiliating, but it had also been liberating. For the first time in my adult life, I was living according to my own values rather than trying to meet someone else's expectations. Jake and I built our marriage on principles that were completely foreign to my family of origin. We made financial decisions together. We supported each other's career goals equally, and we resolved conflicts through honest communication rather than manipulation. When Jake lost his job due to company downsizing, we handled the temporary income reduction through budget adjustments and mutual support, not by exploiting anyone else's resources. Our first year of marriage was everything that Sophia's had failed to be. We faced challenges together, celebrated successes together, and built a partnership based on equality and respect, rather than exploitation and deception. The contrast made me realize how abnormal my family's relationships had always been. 2 years after the settlement, Maria Santos approached me about speaking at a conference for financial professionals about recognizing and addressing family financial abuse. "Your case has become something of a teaching example in our field," she explained. "There are a lot of people who could benefit from hearing your story and understanding that they have options." The speaking engagement was terrifying but also empowering. Standing in front of a room full of financial advisors, attorneys, and victim advocates, I told my story clearly and without apology. I talked about the gradual normalization of exploitation, the way love had been weaponized against me, and the difficulty of breaking free from family manipulation. The audience response was overwhelming. Several people approached me afterward to share similar stories about their own families or clients they'd worked with. One woman told me that my presentation had helped her recognize financial abuse in her own marriage. Another said she was going to use my case as an example when training her staff to recognize signs of family exploitation. That presentation led to other speaking opportunities and eventually to volunteer work with a local organization that supported victims of financial abuse. Working with other people who'd been exploited by family members helped me process my own experience while contributing to something meaningful. Through this work, I met dozens of people who'd been financially abused by spouses, parents, children, and siblings. Their stories varied in details, but shared common themes: the gradual normalization of exploitation, the use of love and loyalty as weapons of manipulation, the difficulty of seeking help when the abuser is someone you're supposed to trust. Many of these victims were older adults whose children had gained access to their finances and systematically drained their retirement accounts. Others were young adults like I'd been, supporting family members who were perfectly capable of supporting themselves. Some were spouses who'd discovered that their partners had been hiding debt or stealing from joint accounts for years. Each story reinforced my understanding that financial abuse is rarely about money alone. It's about power and control, about the abuser's belief that they're entitled to someone else's resources without reciprocal obligations. It's about the systematic erosion of the victim's autonomy and self-worth, until they believe that serving the abuser's interests is their primary purpose in life. 3 years after the settlement, I received another letter from Sophia. This one was different from her first attempt at reconciliation. Instead of focusing on her own suffering and losses, she acknowledged the specific ways Shed participated in manipulating and exploiting me. Shed been in therapy herself, working through issues related to her divorce and subsequent depression, and had come to understand how her behavior had contributed to the family's dysfunction. "I know that I can't undo the damage I participated in," she wrote. "I know that saying sorry doesn't give you back the years you spent supporting all of us instead of building your own life. But I want you to know that I understand now why you had to cut us off, and I respect your decision to protect yourself from further harm." This letter felt genuine in a way that her previous communication hadn't. It didn't ask for anything from me, didn't try to manipulate me into resuming contact, and didn't minimize the harm that had been done. It was simply an acknowledgement of responsibility from someone who'd participated in hurting me. I still didn't respond immediately, but I found myself thinking about Sophia differently, not as someone I needed to reconcile with, but as someone who might be capable of growth and change if she continued working on herself. The possibility of future contact remained open, even if it wasn't appropriate yet. My parents, on the other hand, continued to send occasional cards and emails that suggested they still didn't fully understand why I'd cut contact with them. Their messages focused on missing me and wanting to rebuild our relationship, but they rarely acknowledged the specific behaviors that had necessitated the separation. Their lack of insight suggested that reconciliation would require more work than they were willing or able to do. As I've reflected on this entire experience, I've come to understand that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for yourself is to refuse to be destroyed by someone else's dysfunction. My parents raised me to believe that family loyalty required endless sacrifice and tolerance of harmful behavior. But true family loyalty would never have involved exploiting my love and trust for their financial benefit. The lesson I've learned isn't that family doesn't matter or that forgiveness is impossible. The lesson is that healthy relationships require mutual respect and accountability, regardless of the biological or legal connections between people. Love without boundaries isn't love, it's enablement. And protecting yourself from exploitation isn't selfishness, it's self-respect. Today, Jake and I are building the kind of family I wish I'd grown up in. We're planning to have children someday, and we talk about how to raise them with strong boundaries and self-worth, how to teach them that their value isn't dependent on their ability to solve other people's problems or provide financial resources. We've also built chosen family relationships with friends and extended family members who support our well-being rather than exploiting it. These relationships are based on mutual care and respect rather than obligation and guilt, and they've shown me what healthy family dynamics actually look like. Sometimes people ask me if I regret taking legal action against my parents or if I miss having a relationship with my family of origin. The honest answer is that I grieve the family I thought I had, but I don't miss the family I actually had. I grieve the loss of unconditional love and support, but I don't miss being manipulated and exploited. I've learned that it's possible to love someone while also recognizing that they're harmful to your well-being. I've learned that forgiveness doesn't require reconciliation, and that healing doesn't require maintaining toxic relationships. Most importantly, I've learned that my worth isn't determined by my willingness to be victimized by people who claim to love me. If you're reading this and recognizing elements of your own family dynamics, please know that you deserve relationships based on respect rather than exploitation. You deserve to have your contributions acknowledged rather than taken for granted. You deserve to build a life that serves your own goals and values rather than constantly managing other people's crises. Breaking free from family financial abuse is one of the hardest things a person can do, because it requires challenging everything you've been taught about love and loyalty and family obligation. But freedom from exploitation is worth the pain of separation from people who refuse to treat you with basic decency. Your story doesn't have to end with sacrifice and resentment. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is refuse to continue being someone else's victim, even when that someone is family. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do is give people the opportunity to face the natural consequences of their choices, even if that's painful for everyone involved. The path forward isn't always clear, and the healing process isn't always linear, but it is possible to build a life based on your own worth, rather than someone else's needs. It's possible to create the family you deserve to have, even if you have to do it with people who aren't related to you by blood. And it's possible to find peace with the decisions you make to protect yourself, even when those decisions disappoint people who think they deserve unlimited access to your resources and forgiveness. What would you do if your family betrayed your trust the way mine betrayed me? Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and self-respect? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life family drama stories. And if you know someone who might be dealing with similar family manipulation, please share this video to help them understand that they have options and deserve better treatment. Thank you for listening to my story. And remember that sometimes walking away from toxic relationships is the most loving thing you can do for yourself. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video.